All right, well, welcome everyone to the NASEO webinar on opportunities for states to support a just energy transition. This webinar will be recorded, so thank you all for joining. I'm really excited about the great lineup of speakers we have today and the critical topics that they will be covering. NASEO has been engaged in the just energy transition topic for quite a while now and is hoping to continue to support state energy offices as they navigate their role in this space. With fossil fuel plant closures leading to direct impacts on local communities, this webinar is really meant to provide background on some of the efforts underway to address these issues and hopefully provide some starting points for state energy offices interested in beginning or expanding their work in the just energy transition space. So I wanted to quickly thank the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management for their support of this webinar. So this webinar is actually kicking off a larger effort by NASEO with plans to develop a framework for states with support from DOE on how to support a just energy transition with meaningful tribal and community engagement next year. And the framework is going to provide key considerations for state energy offices on relationship building, workforce opportunities, and the impact of new technologies. And we'll be reaching out to states for input into the framework to ensure that it is actionable. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce your moderator for today, Robert Jackson, the Director of the Michigan Energy Office. He's going to introduce our other speakers and walk you through some of the other items for today. So please be sure to enter questions into the chat function and Q&A box, and Robert will get to those after our speakers. So Robert, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Kelsey. Again, Robert Jackson, Director of the Michigan Energy Office, and it's my pleasure to introduce 5 experts in this area of just energy transition. The first speaker will be Larry Stuckelberg. He's the Division Director at the Michigan Department of Treasury and Community Services Division, and Larry leads Michigan's Energy Transition Impact Project. So with that, I want to turn it over to Larry.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. I'll just give a quick run through of the Energy Transition Impact Project in Michigan. We began a few years back convening a group of people to start a conversation about transition around the closure of the Palisades nuclear facility. That work, as we brought online a team of people with local partners to create a transition strategy around that nuclear plant, got the attention of those who began creating a climate solutions comprehensive plan for the state of Michigan. And I sat on, along with the state treasurer, that planning group. The governor of the state established Executive Directive 2020-10, which created a variety of solutions or ideas on climate solutions, one of which was to create the Energy Transition Impact Project. So as part of this larger issue globally on climate change, of course, we all know our coal facilities are closing, and we all know that those are important anchor institutions in those communities. So we began the process of convening partners at the state, local, and federal level to begin talking about what those communities should be doing to address that change. In one tight geographical area in our downriver communities along the Detroit River, in River Rouge, Ecorse, Wyandotte, Trenton, and Riverview, 2 longstanding coal-fired facilities managed by DTE Energy have closed. Those 2 facilities represent a sizable portion of the property tax base, employment, and just a general impact, as well as the uncertainty now of what those sites are going to be developed into. And the communities themselves are communities which have experienced over these last 30 or 40 years significant disinvestment from the industrial side. Those were near to Detroit. Those were part of the industrial buildup in the mid 20th century. And those are also some of the communities that were hardest hit as various industrial facilities and processes went away. So now they're facing this decline of the carbon or the coal industry. So we've used the experience in Southwest Michigan to convene a group of people. We began a 5-community planning session. We brought together partners from government, from community groups, and the reason I'm here is we had a real focus in this to make sure we're including a just transition strategy as part of that. including reaching deeply to make sure we're bringing those voices to the table as part of the planning strategy. And one of those communities, in fact, in River Rouge, is part of the most polluted zip code in Michigan, which has a separate strategy around working on that issue, which has faced a significant impact from those industrial processes these last 50 years. So we're incorporating within this concept of the energy transition, which was initially focused on the issue of helping communities overcome the loss of those anchor institutions and economic development and community development and job training, where we began infusing the state of Michigan's strategy around environmental justice to make sure it becomes part of our effort to include in that. And then we built that into our federal application for an EDA grant to support this effort. We were successful in that, in getting the planning grant for the transition. And then what we're going to be really focusing on is that smaller communities who are losing these facilities are often under-resourced. They simply have a lack of capacity. And we've heard this many times on conversations like this across the nation, is that communities facing these losses do not have the capacity for the economic development staffing, the grant-making staffing, even the site planning staffing in order to plan for these transitions. So the ETIP is, as I said, convening state and local partners and bringing in federal dollars to bring those resources to the table. They're going to be establishing an economic development staffing arrangement through a local agency. And then we're going to be looking at all 5 communities so that none of them are lost in this conversation, which for us, an experience in Michigan is some of our smaller, older communities do face decline without the resources to respond, particularly as they surround the core metropolitan area. It's a kind of national phenomenon I think most people experience. So for purposes of this conversation, our goal is to make sure that just transition strategy remains active, and that some of the voices in the community, which may not come to the table in some of these, there's an outreach to them, and they are brought to the table to make sure their concerns, their ideas, their thoughts, and their participation is heard, as well as the communities get focused upon for resources to offset, such as the infrastructure investments we're seeing, the investments in housing and housing improvement, the variety of federal programs that are coming along. We're working to make sure some of those resources are steered to those communities to create the environmental justice offset with the loss of jobs and investment in the community. That's in a nutshell what our effort is. And at michigan.gov/ETIP, you can read our annual report. We're building out the website increasingly to be a resource, and we'll be focusing on that in the next 6 months especially, as well as working with our local partners to keep these projects moving and to make sure the state's a partner to convene and bring resources to the local effort. And I'll wait for questions later.
Great, thank you, Larry. And so just to add to that, the Michigan Energy Office was part of the effort, along with the Department of Treasury, the Michigan Public Service Commission, the Department of Labor and Economic Growth. It was a whole state effort to look and focus on how we can provide that assistance. But, so for more information, we place the address in the chat, and Larry will be here to answer questions at the end more about, what Michigan is doing in this area. And so our next speaker is Rachel Young. Rachel is the Director of Grant Making, the Just Transition Fund, and Rachel develops and oversees grant making and fundraising strategies at the Just Transition Fund. With that, I'd like to welcome Rachel Young.
Thank you. Thank you, Robert, for the introduction and for the opportunity to be part of this webinar. I'm excited to learn more about what's happening in Michigan, and look forward to learning more about that. But to introduce myself, I'm, as you said, I'm the Director of Grant Making with the Just Transition Fund. We are a national organization. We work in communities across the country who are impacted by the decline of the coal industry. And our mission is to help them build diversified local economies that are equitable, inclusive, and low carbon. So in my presentation, I'm going to provide some high-level context about the challenges of coal community economic transition, which I suspect is familiar to many of you, and then I'll provide a brief overview of the policies that have been emerging at the state level in recent years that are beginning to address these challenges in very important and exciting ways. So next slide, please. So again, not news to anyone on this call that the coal industry has declined dramatically over the last decade. As coal plants and mines across the country close down, it causes just such major economic distress in communities that have long depended on the coal industry for their livelihoods. Workers are losing good paying jobs with benefits. Lost local tax revenue means that schools and vital public services are facing significant cuts. And these closures can happen with little notice and leave little time to plan for such a major economic upheaval. So the slide has some stats that reflect the scale of this challenge. The number of coal jobs was cut in half over the past decade since its peak in 2011. The challenge is not limited to direct job loss. There's also indirect job loss, as each coal job supports up to 4 other jobs locally. In addition, coal mines and plants directly contribute about $1.8 billion in local and state taxes, contributing an average of 20% in county revenue, and sometimes that figure is much higher. Across the country, about 37 million people live in more than 300 coal-impacted counties. About 19% are Black, Indigenous, or people of color, and about 9% live below the poverty line. And it's also important to note that the worst economic hardship is concentrated in communities that, as Larry was speaking to, in communities already facing long periods of economic decline and disinvestment, as well as environmental degradation and pollution, and public health challenges. And so just the challenges and the really important social dimensions just can't be fully expressed in these numbers. Next slide, please. So about the Just Transition Fund, my organization was created in 2015 to help hard-hit coal communities overcome the economic challenges brought about by the industry's decline. We offer grants and technical assistance to help impacted communities build diversified new economies. And we were created in response to the launch of the Power Initiative during the Obama administration, which is the first time that federal funding was made available specifically for coal communities experiencing economic transition. So we're a national organization, but we take a very bottom-up approach to our work. We believe that the people in communities who are most impacted by this problem have the most innovative and the most durable economic solutions, and we are focused on helping them to grow and scale their work. We're also focused on identifying models that work and that can be replicated and adapted in different places. So even though coal impacted communities are certainly not monolithic and have very different contexts and characteristics, they also share a lot in common, and they have a lot that they can share with and learn from each other. And this is where we try to really play an important role as a network. And then we focus on the communities that are the hardest hit, the places where the economic distress is the worst and that are home to the highest concentration of marginalized communities. So the next slide is a map of the states where we work. We got our start working in Central Appalachia. Again, when the Power Initiative launched, that was a region of the country that was, of course, hit first by the decline of the industry, followed by Western states, and now the Midwest is experiencing a wave of coal plant closures, at the risk of oversimplifying. But the point is that the challenge is really, it's all across the country. It's a broad problem and challenge. And so next slide is just a quick overview of our role with respect to just transition policy specifically. So coal transition is, of course, a very complex problem. It requires comprehensive and systemic solutions to ensure a successful transition at the scale of the problem. A wide range of policies are needed at all levels of government to provide the tools and the programs and the resources that are critically needed by impacted communities. And these policies and programs also need to be designed and implemented in close collaboration with those impacted communities so that they are really meeting needs on the ground and accountable to those needs. And they need to be well coordinated to boot. So our role in all of this, at the federal level, we worked with a really incredible group of coal community leaders across the country to create our National Economic Transition Initiative. So shout out to my fellow co-panelist, Nicole, who is one of the really important partners and leaders in this effort. Through this process, we created a policy framework outlining elements of what a comprehensive national transition program looks like. I know this webinar is, of course, focused on state level policy, but just to put it in a sort of federal policy context, there is, of course, tremendous need and opportunity at the state level as well. At the Just Transition Fund, we support efforts to create and implement robust state transition policy, and in particular, state transition funds. As I know the other panelists will speak to, these provide immediate and much needed relief to workers and communities and help them prepare for what comes next. So next slide, please. So we have been really excited about the potential for state transition funds since one of our community partners helped create the country's first such fund in New York State, where I live, in 2016. So at that time, the community of Tonawanda, which is outside of Buffalo, was facing the impending closure of a major coal-fired power plant called the Huntley Generating Station, and along with it, a huge loss to the local tax base. We helped to support a diverse coalition of labor and environmental and community leaders, including our partner, the Clean Air Coalition of Western New York. And they came together and created a really visionary transition plan for their community. And they also successfully advocated with the state to create what became the country's first transition fund to replace the lost local tax revenue. And as I mentioned, we're very focused on models, and we immediately saw just so much potential in the state transition fund model, and we've been really lifting it up and promoting it ever since. We have a regular national convening of our partners, and that's a space where we have lifted up model state transition policy, and actually just had a convening last month where we had a great robust discussion on this very subject. So next slide, please. In the past few years, a number of other states have begun to consider and to pass a range of transition policies designed to support coal workers and communities, and that's reflected on this map. And here I want to acknowledge our partner, RMI. They recently issued a really great report that goes into a lot of detail about the specific mix of transition policies that exist in every state. That's where this map came from. Our team worked with RMI on this report, and it's a great resource to the field. And so I would direct folks to that to really get in the weeds on transition policy at the state level. So 7 states have now passed bills that include a focus on coal transition. So in addition to New York, those are Colorado, Illinois, New Mexico, Minnesota, Virginia, and Washington. And in most of these cases, the states have passed transition policies as part of a broader climate package, setting carbon-free electricity standards or greenhouse gas reduction targets. And so in these instances, coal transition policies have been designed to address the economic impacts created by the accelerated transition away from fossil fuels. There are a couple of exceptions to this, namely New York and Minnesota, but that's the most often the case. So next slide. Going to conclude with an overview of some of the just major elements of state transition policies. At a high level, these include direct support to workers, primarily focused on training or education. It can also include, however, a direct wage replacement or temporary income support, economic development planning and implementation assistance for coal communities, creation of coal transition plans and stakeholder advisory groups to guide the development of priorities and the implementation of specific programs and resources, incentives to repurpose coal sites for new economic use, especially related to creating renewable energy infrastructure. And then last but not least, funding to offset local tax revenue. This is such a clear and critically important need, but it's a gap in most state policies that do exist. Following New York's lead, Colorado and Illinois have been the only 2 states to create funding for this purpose. And I want to really acknowledge Colorado as a real leader on state transition policy with the creation of their Office on Just Transition a couple of years ago. And then more recently, Illinois has passed major transition policy, and those funding programs are just beginning to be implemented. And so there's a lot to learn from the experiences in these states about what's working and where the gaps are. Both by leaders in other states looking to create transition policy and also by federal policymakers. And so I'm going to leave it there and excited to hear about the work that my co-panelists are leading their communities and states to advance transition policy on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rachel. So our next presenter is Nicole Horseheader. She's the co-founder and director of Sacred Water Speaks. Nicole is from the Black Mesa region of the Navajo Nation, and her work is rooted in protecting the waters of the Black Mesa. Nicole? Okay.
Whoops. Okay. Sorry. I was still on mute. Thank you very much for that introduction. And so just transition here. Actually, let me go a little bit more into where my work is here in the state of Arizona. So I'm in the northeast region of Arizona on the Navajo Nation, and it is the only place in the state of Arizona where coal is actually mined. All other generating stations in the state of Arizona actually bring in their coal from either Wyoming or used to be Colorado too, but I think today it's just only Wyoming. So I live in a coal impacted area, one of the very largest coal-fired power plants in our region, the Navajo Generating Station, shut down in 2019. But surrounding the Navajo Nation, a very large region, often people describe it as equivalent to the state of West Virginia, is situated 7 other coal-fired power plants. And all of them have expiration dates. Many of them are going to be coming down this year and next year. The rest of them within the decade, less than 10 years from now. The largest one having shut down in 2019, as I mentioned before. Just transition in our state is, of course, driven by the dramatically changing economics of the region. But to expand a little bit more on that, coal-fired power plants on and near the Navajo reservation oftentimes have operated with the use of cheap resources usually from indigenous lands. So for example, the Navajo Generating Station operated for about 5 decades with buying coal at under market prices, getting water to operate the power plant for free, right of ways to the plant were often waived. Oftentimes the revenue and the tax were set low in exchange for a couple hundred jobs. And so now these coal-fired power plants and these coal mines are shutting down. I want to also mention that the Navajo Nation territories expand into New Mexico, Utah, and today Colorado. And so we do have coal-fired power plants in New Mexico as well. And so this change is forcing a reckoning for communities such as mine who have been dependent economically on coal for generations. So many of the communities, like the one I come from and the ones near the coal-fired power plants or the coal mines, have become reliant on that economy. And going forward, we understand as communities impacted by coal that we have to make sure that we stay engaged in this transition that's happening today, or else we'll repeat some of the same business structures, contracts, and leases of the past. A lot of those contracts and the structure of those business agreements were often one-sided. More of the benefits towards the utility side or the ratepayers, were more of the beneficiaries, and the communities were oftentimes shouldering the costs, the environmental costs, the health costs, and the economic costs of these big projects. Next slide, please. Just to give you a snapshot, this is only 4 coal-fired power plants in our region. These ones happen to be nearest the Navajo Nation, where I come from. The Navajo Generating Station was the largest, 2,250 megawatts. The San Juan Generating Station, which officially closed just about last month, is also at about 1,800 megawatts. The Four Corners Power Plant, which is also right in the same region, the Four Corners region, very close. It sits on the Navajo Nation, actually, this plant does, and is at about, is over 1,000 megawatts as well. And then the Choya power plant, which sits south of the reservation, is scheduled to close here in the next couple of years. All in all, that's a lot of megawatts of energy that is going away. Happy to say a lot of carbon is also going to be cut after all this power plants go away. But the thing that we have to look forward to is that something's going to replace this power. And if we don't get out front and say what that power should be, other outside companies, outside corporations can come in and use the transmission lines that will become idle from the closure of these power plants. So it's important for communities like ours, which we're in a water crisis in Arizona. If you hear Arizona state officials talking about the water crisis, Indigenous people in northern Arizona are living it, whereas leadership in Arizona are still just talking about it. They have yet to start planning transition in ways in which we're going to better manage our water, and we're going to grow our economy with projects that are more sustainable and don't use water, especially precious drinking water sources, for industry purposes, which is what happened to the Navajo Nation here in the last 5 decades with these coal-fired power plants. Is we committed a lot of pristine groundwater and a lot of potable river water for this type of industry. So it's actually very important for communities like ours, like mine, organizations such as ours, to continue to be upfront and with the resources needed to continue to advocate for what transition should look like, and really lay that foundation for what the rest of the nation should look forward to when it comes to transition. Next slide, please. Some of the things that are missing oftentimes in tribal governments and tribal planning groups when it comes to transition is priorities. For the last century here now, we have had outside corporations, coal mining companies, gas companies come in and tell our governments what's good for us. And we've had utilities do that, and even federal government agencies tell us that. Federal agencies especially help broker a lot of these deals for Indian communities. It's very important for those that are trying to make sure that funding is getting to where it needs to get to, recognize that organizations such as Twinajana have solutions that are going to be the best solutions for the community in terms of preserving certain resources so that the communities can thrive, survive, and grow in ways in which is sustainable. Some of the work that Twinajana is doing is that, first of all, water drives our planning. Water drives how we decide how transitions should be is realized. In Arizona, we get less than 8 inches of rainfall a year. In Arizona, the Dene people, my people, the often commonly called Navajos, Navajo Nation, we have no water rights in Arizona. We are the largest indigenous nation in Arizona, and we have no water rights. And that's all, that's another story that, is very political in itself. And so with what little waters that we have access to, we want to make sure that we grow our economy in the wake of these closed power plants in ways in which we're not creating a greater water deficit, and that we're allowing aquifers that have been overused by industry to actually recover. So water needs to drive transition. Likewise, clean air needs to drive transition. In addition, you know, the condition of land, especially for farming purposes and other economic purposes, living for people to be able to live on healthy land, that should be the driving, that should drive transition as well. So that's the most, I think, the most important thing that I wanted to start out with. Two initiatives that have come out of this priority is just and equitable, what I'm calling just and equitable transition, but more specifically our work with the Arizona Corporation Commission. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to bring back the owners of the now closed Navajo generating station, these utilities, and there are 6 owners of this now closed power plant, the federal government being one of them, that we're bringing them back, and we're saying, you can't just walk away. You've got to come back, and you've got to, one, continue to create energy projects on the Navajo Nation, more specifically renewable energy projects on the Navajo Nation, partnering with the tribe so that we're putting like Navajo renewable energy back on these transmission lines that are now idle from these closed plants, and a commitment from the utilities to buy this power. And so our work is not just in the Arizona Utility Commission, who's the regulatory body of the utilities in Arizona, but also in the state of California and Nevada, and with the Bureau of Reclamation, all of whom have ownership shares to the now closed Navajo generating station, and hence own the transmission lines in about the same ratio as they owned the power plant. So instead of allowing utilities to walk away, to bring them back and to ensure that the energy is replaced, but the economy doesn't just go off a cliff on the Navajo, with it for Navajo communities and the Navajo government. The other thing that we're working on is reclamation. Close to 60,000 acres were set aside for mining purposes. The coal at these two, within this lease area, this mine site lease area, some of the coal was dedicated to the now closed Mojave generating station, which closed in 2005. But more recently, the other part of that coal was dedicated to the Navajo generating station. Huge tracts of land need to be reclaimed. We're in a situation where, as Indigenous people who were given reservations to live on as our permanent homeland in this colonized society that we live in now, we want to make sure that the lands are returned to us, mined lands are returned to us in a condition in which it's livable and usable. And that includes the reclamation of the water. And we always say that clean lands and clean waters are the foundation of transition, are the foundations of economic development. And this is another big project that we're working on, and we're trying to make sure that the Peabody Coal Company comes back and reclamation happens, and reclamation is completed in a robust way, in which not only the lands are returned in a good condition as received, but the water sources are returned as well. Next slide, please. So it's important to know that there are many indigenous nations that are facing similar situations as ours, as coal impacted communities, coal impacted tribes. But it's the important thing to remember is that indigenous nations' needs and challenges are as complex as any community across the United States, that we can't just be pushed into, we're not just in the same, we can't just be, we're not in the same boat. We're not in the same, you can't just describe our situation in one broad stroke. There were complex communities with complex living situations, economic situations. A lot of it is created by federal policy, and a lot of it is created by the lack of expertise and the lack of technical assistance at the tribal government level. And so when we're talking about all these funds becoming available to tribal groups, one in the state of Arizona, because I think nobody from Arizona is on this call, that a lot of us are in tougher situations because our state doesn't recognize that just and equitable transition or just transition is something that exists, and is something, and ways to address transition is something that is needed. And so for us particularly, we're going to have really good lines of communications open between us and the federal government, or us and any other entity that has access to these funds directly. What I want to stress here is that organizations such as, let me back up a little bit. I think I jumped the gun a little bit. Oftentimes when we're dealing with federal agencies, we're often told that we have a government to government relationship. And so that usually means that organizations such as ours get left out of conversations or are not considered when it comes time to, like, say, federal funding. Oftentimes funds go straight from wherever it is that they are initiated down straight to the central government level. For us, it would be the Navajo Nation. The Navajo Nation then has multiple steps that it must take before it actually gets to the community. It's very important that federal entities, government entities recognize that tribal groups such as ours, who have who are incorporated with the Navajo Nation, are also places that can accept funds and actually get it to the community groups and places where it's needed a lot more efficiently than tribal governments can. And so, when we're trying to do advocacy work, we oftentimes don't even have the same kind of standing that outside environmental groups or outside advocacy groups have. Like, say, for instance, I hate to always be picking on Sierra Club, but let me pick on Sierra Club a little bit, is that oftentimes we don't get seen on the same level field as, like, say, a group like Sierra Club. They have actually access to federal groups, federal funds. Those outside, nonprofit groups are often seen as entities with voices and entities who are legitimate advocacy groups. And when it comes to tribal advocacy groups like ours, oftentimes people want to go around us and go straight to the tribal government level and want to just deal with government officials there. And so I want to make sure that people see that dynamics that's happening there, and be careful not to ignore the work of tribal groups and the legitimacy of the work that tribal groups do for the communities. Next slide, please. And I would just like to close out by saying that we are a small organization, but we have worked in the area of water. We've worked in the area of protecting water resources and other resources for about 2 decades. And so Sacred Water Speaks, while it's based in a very rural area of Black Mesa, we have grown significantly in the last couple of years and have become a powerhouse here on the Navajo Nation, and are at the forefront. We're at the forefront of transition issues here on the Navajo Nation. And so thank you very much for this time, and I'll allow the next person to speak.
Thank you, Nicole. For those of you who are not familiar with Nicole's work or Sacred Water Speaks, I highly recommend that you research it on the internet. And there's a number of very good, informative YouTube videos that really talks about what she's doing and what the organization is about. So with that, and before we go to the next speaker, I just want to encourage everyone, if you have a question, please put it in the chat and we'll address those questions at the end. And so our next speaker is Kirsten McPherson. She's the Community and Economic Development Manager at the Colorado Office of Just Transition. Kirsten is a behavioral economist and primarily focuses on transitioning economies such as relevant communities and other industrial communities in working with their redevelopment and strategies and communication programs. In fact, when Michigan was looking at how it was going to approach this just transition work, we did reach out to Colorado, and they were very helpful to us. So with that, I want to turn it over to Kirsten McPherson.
Perfect. Thank you, Robert. Yeah, nice to be here with everyone today. I'm learning a ton. I've been doing this work for quite a while. I live in a coal community. I'm actually the coal kid on our team. So there's 4 of us at the Office of Just Transition, and I live in Craig, so one of the tri-state communities. My dad is a coal miner, has been for 45 years. He'll be retiring next year. So this is a topic that has been on my family's dinner table since I can remember. So I'm really glad that I get to be able to do this work. And it means so much that I get to impact my community as well as the entire state. So I'll let you go to the next slide. So this is what coal in Colorado looks like as of 2019. There has been some changes, but you can kind of see all of the different power plants and coal mines. The coal mines are notated in the blue dots, and the power plants are in the red dots. And so I live up in the top northwest corner. So where it says 1 and 2, I live at 2. So we have Colorado, Colorado, Trapper, we have Peabody, we have Desirado as our mines, and then we have 2 power plants. One is an Excel station, and the other one is a tri-state station. And so we serve 4 primary areas. We have the Yampa Valley, which is our largest service area that we're working with. We have the west end of Montrose County, which includes where the nucleus station was. It is now closed. And it also includes Morgan County and Pueblo. So if we go to the next slide, this is what we're anticipating for 2030. So as you can see, pretty much nothing exists after that. And then the Comanche station is really going to be pretty much completely gone as well after January 1st-ish. And so you can see how dramatic the transition actually is. The remaining coal mines are all producing coal for other power plants and other places across the state, across the world. And then the only one that we kind of aren't super sure of is Peabody Coal Mine, which is in the Yampa Valley region as well. So if we go to the next slide. So the collective impacts, this is not a tiny little beast as you can imagine, and what we've been talking about today. It's a total loss of $3.2 billion in commercial property value. That is a lot. It has 95 districts, including the fire districts, school districts, college districts, cemetery, library, hospital, you name it. Taxpayers are funding it, and a large part of these, especially rural communities, it equals to close to over half of what their actual tax base is. Here in Moffat County equals about 65% of our total tax base for our primary services are due to the coal and the coal industry. And then when we look at job losses in total, it's an 825 power plant workers and 866 miners. And then we have a whole slew of supply chain and then all of the impacts that kind of relate to who lives in these areas because of this industry in the first place. I will say that the conversations around workforce are not my purview. So I'm going to briefly touch on some of those different things, but Shelley Simon in our office is the workforce manager when it comes down to all of that. So if you go to the next slide. So Colorado's approach. Colorado is the first state that has made an active investment into what this transition looks like. And you've already heard who has been kind of following up. I think the newest is Minnesota. So we've been having lots of conversations with the Minnesota Office of Just Transition, which is really fun for me because before I took this job, I was actually a transition coordinator up in the Grand Rapids area. So I was working on some transition work with the power plant up there, which is Boswell. So in 2019, House Bill 1913-14 started, and so this created the Office of Just Transition and hired our first staff person, which is the director, Wade Buchanan. And it also included how we're going to set up the entire office. And so we have an advisory committee that includes 19 members representing key interest areas, anywhere from workforce, we have miners, we have other industry, we have education, we have economic development professionals, we have a whole slew of various different groups, and these are all spread out from the entire state. So all of the impacted regions have someone representing them. And then we have House Bill 21-1290. This happened in 2020, 2021. This started our very first funding allocation. So post-COVID, we had some extra money left in the coffers. And so our legislature decided to invest in the Office of Just Transition. And so that means $8 million over 2 years for the overall plan, which is the community investment side, and then $7 million over 2 years for the coal transition and workforce assistance program. Next slide, please. And so the next one that we had this year, which is House Bill 1394, we have a whole, some additional money, but also it changed how fast we had to spend the money. On the previous slide, it said that we had 2 years, which meant that we had to originally dole out about 70% of that in about 6 months when I first came on. That was a pretty heavy lift. And so when this bill came along, it was really nice that we were able to spread that money out. One of the things that we noticed is, and it's kind of an unfortunate thing to say, but we almost got money to transition a little bit too fast. And we had to spend that initial bucket a little bit too fast. So that means that we didn't have a chance to really work with the communities when it comes to their transition strategy, what their needs actually are, and what they wanted to look forward towards in the future. If we could have had a glass ball and made some additional changes, I would think that we would probably want to hold off on actual community investment grants for about 3 years, as we kind of build relationships with the communities and our interagency working groups and various things like that. So that's just kind of a school of thought for other states looking to do this. Sometimes money can happen a little bit too quickly, and what that money can fund maybe is not necessarily the biggest impact for closures in 10 years. So with this, we ended up with another $5 million. This is a very different bucket. It's not as flexible as my first round of grants. And so this one is really focusing on business retention and expansion. Expanding private investment and site selection. It also included another $10 million towards the workforce transition program. Next slide, please. So our Colorado Just Transition Action Plan, which you can find if you want a enthralling read before bed sometime, you can read our Just Transition Action Plan that's on our website. But this kind of talks about the overall broad plan for the entire office. So from each community, we want more family sustaining jobs, a broader property tax base, and measurably more economic diversity. Most of these communities, except for probably Pueblo, are all small rural communities that have really been built based off of energy. Each of our communities are at a very different place when it comes to their transition and what their overall needs are. We have some communities that need basic infrastructure projects and some that are really ready to start attracting new investment. My goal as the economic development kind of lead on this is to help the communities attract, let's say, 10 businesses that each can hire 10 people. As opposed to one business that hires 300. So that's really kind of what we're looking towards, is how to make the most economic diversity possible. And then for each laid off worker, a good new family sustaining job, comparable income, and then economic security. It's really hard to transition jobs that are on a high school education where people are making six figures. That type of industry doesn't necessarily exist anymore, especially in these smaller rural areas. So it's becoming quite a challenge, and it's a very large puzzle for us to figure out. Next slide, please. So just to kind of give you a snapshot, I included some of what our grants are so far. You can see it's quite a large list, and I left out some of them that are still pending. I also kind of left off a couple that I just forgot about until right now. But this was we ended up getting out almost $4.5 million in 7 months. That is not an easy feat, especially for an office of 4. I will say that our partnerships with other state programs, such as the Department of Local Affairs, our Office of International Development and Economic Development and International Trade, are all really important. But as you kind of see through this list, you can kind of start seeing some basic things that are coming out as standards for our communities. If you go to the next slide, please. So the community highlights, so the primary themes are definitely looking at outdoor recreation. We've funded 3 river projects right now, and they're all in one region. So we're really hoping that that's going to be a regional poll. Part of the office is really looking at a regional activity in general, and what that ends up doing just for the economic advancement as a whole. And so some of our regions, like the Yampa Valley, is much larger than some others, like Morgan County. We see a lot of infrastructure projects, especially down at the west end. So this is Nucla, Natarita, and Norwood. A lot of capacity building, which is really big. So we have just transition strategies that are being built. We have people who are going to be hired to specifically work on the transition over the next 4 to 5 years. So it's really exciting to be able to see how communities are kind of thinking outside the box as well. And then we've also funded 2 business parks. So overall, with our $4.5 million that we've given out, we've been able to leverage over $30 million with matches from the Economic Development Administration, DOLA, USDA, and so many others. So it's a really big feat, and I'm super proud of us and our office for the stuff that we've been able to accomplish. I have been with the office for a total of 1 year in September, and so that was pretty much all 3 of us that were hired on. So Wade was in on 2020 is when he was hired, and then we all came on last year. So it's a lot of work for a tiny, mighty office of 4. Next slide, please. So looking for some additional stuff that we're working on, we are launching some community investment workshops. So this is a tailored approach to be able to attract some different funding besides just grant funds. So really impact investors, foundations, and the like for special projects. Really focusing on business retention and expansion. So how can we help support our smaller businesses, especially when you're looking at some of these communities who's patronizing the actual, like your bars and restaurants and some of these other things. So how are we going to like stabilize the actual economy as a whole, as opposed to just the major industry that's leaving? We're also launching some community mentoring and collaboration. So we're doing monthly calls of all of our communities so they can share what's working for them, especially when it comes to workforce, different projects that they're doing, all of those different pieces. And next slide. So this is just kind of looking at some of the guiding principles. We're really trying to, so it has to be community led, while also recognizing that there's a time limit and some different pieces that are going on. And so how can we be the best stewards for these communities? And some challenges as well. I think the thing that I always try to bring up to everyone whenever I'm talking is that this is a cultural change and a cultural shift. much like ourselves, if you are a nurse or a teacher or a insert whatever your job is, that is your identity. These communities are undergoing that same thing. So they are an energy town, they are a coal town, they are so it's not a small dynamic shift at all, especially on a cultural and behavioral standpoint. And so that's something that I always want to make sure everyone's aware of, because we always have those dynamics that are going to make the work that we do a little bit different, and it's just basic cultural transition as well. Next slide. I talked real fast. So if you have any questions, I'll wait towards the end, but my direct contact info is on here as well.
Great. Thank you, Kirsty. So, Kirsty, if you could provide a kind of a link to the Colorado bills that created the Office of Just Transition, that would be great. That was one of the questions that was in the link.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Okay. So now you know why Michigan reached out to Colorado to help with our Just Transition plan. So our next speaker is Kathy Brown. She's the Director of Rural Outreach and Development, the Greater Peoria Economic Development Council. Kathy has expertise in community and economic development, strategic planning, asset mapping, surveys, and evaluation and design that focuses on stakeholders' defined outcomes with building community and communities of interest and communities of place. So with that, please welcome Kathy.
Thank you. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to share. And as our previous speaker said, it's been a great listening opportunity for me as well, learning and thinking of strategies that we can employ within our region. I am speaking on today, I'm speaking on behalf of the Greater Peoria Economic Development Council, and we are a regional economic development organization holding many of those traditional roles, but we also represent our economic development district as deemed by the Economic Development Administration. So that gives us kind of a unique position within our region, in that we are charged both with economic development strategies and have a planning interest for our regions as well. We're located right in the center of the state of Illinois, with Peoria, Tazewell, Woodford, Mason, and Logan counties being served through our agency. For us in Illinois, we probably look very similar to the other regions that you talked about. Here is a map that was created for the state of Illinois that illustrates what coal power plants looked like in 2008. And the red dots indicate the number of plants that are closed or changing. And all of this is happening really rapidly. And I think that's one of the key points that I want to emphasize for states, in that how we became involved in this is that the communities, the local communities, were really caught totally off guard by these announcements of closures. They didn't see it coming at all. And the state of Illinois had no policies that really mandated these power companies give advance notice of their closing or their plans. So within 3 to 6 months, the announcements came and the plants were closed. So it was really a whirlwind of activity that these communities had to respond really rapidly to a huge economic shift in their communities. And that was happening throughout central Illinois and beyond. So this gives you kind of, it's not, historically, it's not been just the power plants in Illinois, but also we are part of that coal mining basin that would include also Illinois, Indiana, and Kentucky. And if you look at national strategy around coal transitioning, you can see a reference to this Illinois basin as a priority or strategic area to pay attention to, and one that we need to be concerned about the economic transitioning that can occur there. So here's some of the headlines that we're seeing all over the state. I think because of the conversation that has taken place within our region and other regions, hopefully that's helping these future plant closures. And one of the things that we did in partnership with Just Transition Fund, University of Illinois Extension, our economic development organization, and Prairie Rivers Network is that we hosted listening sessions at the community level. And I heard several of the other states talk about that. And for me, being a part of those conversations as these headlines were emerging and the turmoil was happening within the community was one of the most enlightening periods in my career, because I actually felt like the community's voice was being listened to by policymakers, and felt very confident that by giving the community members an upfront chance to talk to policymakers, agencies, as the legislation was being formed, that we had much better policy that was being created in our state due to those local community voices being a part of it. We hosted probably a half a dozen listening sessions within the communities, engaging a broad cross-section of stakeholders, all being devastated by the loss of property tax revenue, loss of jobs, and thinking about how can we transition away from this significant job loss and significant tax base to sustaining our local government services, as well as local businesses in the region. So Havana is one. We have 3 power plants that are really close, contiguous in our greater Peoria EDC region. And they were a key part of those listening sessions that I mentioned. It doesn't seem like when you look at the number of jobs that were lost, it doesn't seem that significant in terms of, you know, larger plants or facilities. But in a small community, those really good paying jobs mean a lot to that local economy. And it meant a lot to those families. And some of what we heard from the community college and the educational institutions as those closures happened and people started to think about how can they transition to other work is a real need to be able to provide that kind of just-in-time credentialing. And so I'm sure this is happening in other parts of the country, but as people are laid off and thinking about other career pathways, it's really important that they have those kind of short-term credentialing opportunities present nearby that they can transition easily into a job. And the other thing that our educational institutions, our community colleges and higher ed pointed out, is when that layoff happens and you have such a strong, significant impact on a household income, that changes their eligibility. It should change their eligibility for student aid. And we had to change policy in Illinois in order to make that happen. So with that great loss of income, there should have been a lot more students coming into college or community colleges that would be eligible for Pell Grants in Illinois, for example. And because it's based off of income taxes, that loss of salary doesn't show up right away. And so we had to we're able to make some policy adjustments to incorporate that. I think this list beyond the layoffs begins to point to an issue that each of you have brought up, and that is that these are major disinvestments in our communities in terms of that tax revenue base. And this really was the panic button for all of the communities involved, because they never dealt with anything of that magnitude before in their communities. And they didn't feel at all ready to negotiate with the power companies, and had a lot of distrust in the conversations that they were having with the utility companies. And as a region, they really bonded together in shared conversations and information that helped them in positioning and kind of navigating through the agreements that were reached with the utility companies. And this seems to be an area where state policy could really help these communities, because one of the downsides that happened, because all of the energy was really spent in conversation around what do we do to replace this lost tax revenue, it was really hard for them to move beyond that and begin to think forward. You know, what kind of economic development strategies do we need to create to replace that closing plant? And so, you know, they were grappling with a critical issue, but it was impeding their ability to think forward. And I think the other thing that happens in this loss of tax revenue is to think really holistically within your community, all the services that are being supported. And the impact is felt, you know, really differently by different aspects of the community. So you see the school district's impact was 17% of their revenue base was coming in from that coal plant. And then the park district, the same. So here we have a beautiful park service within this riverfront community that was losing a significant amount of capital and operational funds, and even down to the really small library, that understanding the impact that that loss of tax revenue would bring. So we really engaged in, this is actually a slide that was put together by Prairie Rivers Network, and talking about the number of community dialogues that were held. And the whole notion behind that was to help communities get involved in that state policy discussion. So it was coal impacted communities and beyond. We did pass new legislation, the Clean Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, in September of 2021. And that policy, as I stated already, was greatly informed by these conversations at the community level. And that very first bullet, I think, the energy transition community grants and working with communities to help them build those short-term strategies for tax replacement dollars. The state of Illinois is very open to that in first round of funding opportunities. And they do want communities to think longer term, but they recognize that that most pressing and immediate issue is sustaining the local services that make all these communities great places to live and work. So they want to preserve that small town community. There is an Energy Transition Workforce Commission, and we have strategically placed workforce development centers throughout the state so that they're geographically dispersed and hopefully accessible to many. And the emphasis with those workforce centers will be to help them transition to clean energy types of jobs. And these centers, the conversations around that, the planning, the geographies have already been defined, and they're in the process right now of writing curriculum that will be implemented in these different workforce centers throughout the state. The scholarship piece, and then an emphasis on solar and energy. So you can begin to see that as we look at the map here in a second. So here's what we're starting to see with this coal to solar initiative. And you know, this is really encouraging for each of these facilities to see how the power plants have been able to leverage this new legislation in Illinois to rapidly change to clean energy solutions. I think the big question at the community level still remains, we don't have policy guiding that tax assessment piece. And so as I talk to community leaders, that's still a big conundrum of knowing, what's appropriate, what they're being told that assessed value should be will more than replace what the coal power plant generated, but yet there's nothing firm about that. So we really do need policy guidance on how to assess. We have it for solar, but we do not have it for battery storage in Illinois yet. So how to assess wind and solar and battery storage is of an issue, I think, as we make these transitions. So these are some just more examples of some of the listening sessions. Illinois has, I think, bought into this in a significant way. One of our struggles as an economic development organization has been just keeping up with all the funding that's flowing through the state of Illinois and federal pass-through dollars. And the agencies have learned a lot about the administration challenges of those, and really are, I feel like as a state, that they're working hard to listen and understand from a business or community standpoint, how can they develop these programs so that they are most manageable and really serve the need that they are intended to. Just recently, the state of Illinois released a request for information, and we repeated listening sessions in each of the communities to gather information for our state Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity that will help them in writing grant guidelines that we expect to be issued or released sometime after the first of the year. But so they're really wanting to get a sense of, where our communities are now and what they're thinking, what strategies they want to put in place for replacement of revenues at the community level. We recently, at the same time, you may be experiencing this in your states as well, but under the leadership of the interagency working group at the federal level, we have had 3 different convenings in Illinois, helping our regions, our communities begin to think about how federal agency funding is being organized to support these communities that are struggling with coal transitioning economies. Recently, we were in Carbondale, Illinois, and joined with representatives from Indiana and Kentucky, and had an opportunity to visit with federal agency leads working on this interagency working group. And each of them highlighted different programs that are in play that could be considered at the community level to support this transition. And I have to commend the both state and federal agencies for putting that level of effort into, making that connection at the community level and really stimulating that thought and conversation, if you will, for future direction. So here, just to give you a snapshot, in our meetings, there's a SWOT analysis that we conducted at the community level, because all of you know that in planning, your greatest opportunities is to look at those assets. What are your existing strengths that you can build upon? Those have the greatest opportunity for supporting economic transition. And here you see just a snapshot of one of our communities. They've invested a lot in their downtown. They've got almost $3 million of renovations in the street and buildings in downtown Havana. So investing in small businesses will be a critical piece of Havana's revitalization. Havana has excellent Port Authority possibilities. They're on the Illinois River, 3 major grain handling facilities on that river, and they've created a terminal that is accepting wind turbines. So that whole notion of utilizing the river for transportation and leveraging those multimodal connections is going to be a critical piece of their economic opportunity going forward. A number of agencies, they're seeing the health department, the school district, the hospital, all of them are making significant investments in solar as cost-saving measures that will help them going forward. And then recreation and tourism is really a burgeoning area for this community because they're considered a gateway along the Illinois River and a gateway to at least 5 different state and national wildlife preserve areas. So there's a lot of opportunity in tourism development for this region. And then you see those are pumpkins. It is a traditional corn and soybean area, but they also, because of their aquifer, kind of the opposite of our Western states, they have a really high water table, and that aquifer provides great irrigation for a variety of specialty crops that are grown in this county. So that's another opportunity for diversification of the local economy that could be pursued. The bottom picture that you see is the community college, and I have to say that voice, our community college voice and leadership, has been so sound and strong in the community conversations, and they represent a really important voice in what we're talking and thinking about in terms of transitioning for the region and for that local economy. So that's what I had to share in terms of perspective and where we're at. And I welcome the opportunity for additional questions or that you might have. I know that was really brief, but kind of a snapshot of how we've approached that as a region and how it has interplayed with the other state initiatives. And I think I said this at the beginning, but I feel like an important part of what our states can do is connect us not only with state agency supports in these conversations of transition, but we have a number of other resources. Like when we were doing these community conversations, Just Transition Fund was so helpful because they had all of this background and history around what's happening all across the nation in coal economies, as was Prairie Rivers Resource Network. And so the collaboration that was formed in our region, really helped us building strategy and moving forward.
Okay. Well, thank you. So all of our are very passionate about what the work that they do. And we do have some questions that have come in from the audience. And I'd like the panel to consider them. And so one of the questions that I'm seeing is that, can the speakers discuss the public perception and experience around moving to jobs in the clean energy sector, especially in the coal communities? And for instance, what is the perception, barriers, or opportunities associated with transitioning coal workers to solar installers or developing solar array in coal communities? And so I'm going to go to Nicole first, because I think she responded, but for some technical issue, it was lost. So Nicole?
Can you repeat the question?
So the question is, can you talk about and discuss the public perception and experience around moving to jobs that within the clean energy sector, especially in coal communities? For instance, what is the perception, barriers, or opportunities associated with transitioning coal workers to solar installers or developing solar arrays in coal communities?
I think that, that's a lot of different questions. I think that for the work that we do, I think the utilities hear our message loud and clear about the fact that we have to conserve water, that we're in a water crisis, that the replacement power should be renewable energy. And so I think that message is out there, and I think the utilities understand where we're coming from. And they're also understanding that this is their situation also, that they have got to move towards renewable energy and not do more fossil fuel, because more fossil fuel means more water, and water is just something that we don't have. Arizona is a perfect place for solar renewable energy, and the real wall that I see is elected officials, and that's where the change has to happen. And so we're the first to bring the topic of just and equitable transition to the Arizona Corporation Commission. Beyond that, there is no energy transition office. There is no energy office. Our governor is not talking about the need for a transition. I mean, we've got more than 5 more coal plants that are coming down here in the state of Arizona. And, the whole northern Arizona is coal impacted. So I think that's where the challenge is to continue to talk to leadership and help them understand that this is important. I don't know if I answered all of your question, but I feel like there's still something missing that I didn't respond to.
Well, I guess I wanted to give the others an opportunity to respond. It's just more or less, what is the perception of within your states about moving jobs away to the clean energy sector? Is it looked at as something that's something that we should transition to? I just
Can I touch on that real quick?
Sure.
Yeah, so I kind of talked in my presentation about the cultural and dynamic change from each community. I think there's an identity component to all of this that is being overlooked some. And that's what I've been trying to pull into a lot of the work that I'm doing. Unfortunately, most of these communities as well, especially when it comes to the workers, they're generally more fiscal when it comes to certain things. They're typically Republicans, they're blue collar workers. There's a lot of different pieces involved with all of this. And when you're telling them that their jobs are going away, of course, there's a very large part that doesn't want to necessarily believe that, which I think is really understandable. We also are faced now with kind of based off of everything that's happening overseas, coal became king again recently. And that has made a huge impact because now the demand is back up. So now, of course, we were kind of getting close, like, nope, this is happening. This transition is happening, all of these different pieces. And then we saw a kick back up in coal and everybody's like, no, it's not. Like, we can't even hire fast enough to do all this. And so there's that dynamic switch when it comes to everything. And I think, unfortunately, there's going to still be some people that are going to be caught off guard when everything actually does transition. There's also a really large push. Xcel Energy, for example, has committed to having 0 layoffs. So they're handling everything through attrition. They're also working on special projects to be able to transition their workforce somewhere else. And so that's a really big component of this as well. But when you're looking at that specific question, I think it's more of a cultural conversation of each of these areas that are embedded as a coal community as opposed to anything else.
Okay.
Can I add something to that? I probably will get these numbers wrong, Robert, but I think our community college, when they went into, so we had 2 plants closed just back to back. that were both a part of Spoon River College District. And when they went in and met with those employees and their families, the statistics that I'm remembering is about a third of them were ready for retirement, and they just took retirement and they left the plant. There was another third that easily transitioned into other work. There's a lot of technical skills in the work that we were talking about with the power plants that they easily translated into another existing power plant or into a manufacturing entity that might have been nearby. We have folks driving, it's pretty typical to drive an hour plus for jobs or work in our region. And then there was a third that took that opportunity to retrain. So there was about a third of that employment base who really worked earnestly with the community college and identified a new career. So I know that doesn't answer your question directly, but I think it kind of gives you a sense of how people deal with a transition of that sort. I think my other observation would be that solar and wind are happening so rapidly in our state that most of what is being built is coming in from other states. So that workforce is not local at this point. And so finding ways to bridge those local workforce opportunities, I think, is a real challenge at this point, because those companies are coming in from other areas, and they're not long-term jobs either. What we see with wind, a company comes in and does a build, the team they leave behind is really small. It may be 3-4 people that stay with that wind farm for maintenance purposes.
Okay. So I want to give Rachel and Larry an opportunity to respond.
Well, I'll just jump in and I'll say, I think that Kirsty made a good point on this idea of identity. A person who works in an industrial process in Michigan, whether it's an auto facility or a coal plant, doesn't necessarily see themselves transitioning into moving to a rural area to put in wind and solar equipment. And they identify really with their sense of being part of an industrial industry. They may transition into other industrial industries, take opportunities for retirement, et cetera. And so I don't know that that's our equivalence just because it's generating electricity, that there is a natural flow from the workforce from a coal-fired power plant into a rural area in Michigan, where Michigan's putting in a great deal of solar panels and wind, and you just keep seeing those expanding across the farmlands of Michigan. I just don't know that's the same workforce, but that identity piece, which we've all experienced in Michigan over these last 30 or 40 years of transition in the auto industry, does play into the issue of whether people see their pathway through a community college into transitioning into another industry. Most of them go out and look for other industrial employment.
Great. Thank you.
And I'll just add, appreciate all the comments that have been made and would echo those. And I think at our work, we often emphasize that the transition is not just about kind of coal to clean in a sort of one-to-one way, which I know is not what the questioner was suggesting, but I think it's just really important to really emphasize that the transition is about building really diversified local economies. And so in some places there will be opportunities in clean energy, but it's really important to explore based on the assets of a place where the, what sectors and industries hold the most potential for employment, and how to transition coal impacted workers into those sectors as appropriate. And I know we're running into time, so I'll leave it there.
Great. I want to thank the panel, and then I want to turn everything over to Kelsey for the last word.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much, Robert, Larry, Nicole, Kathy, Kirsty, and Rachel. This was a really enlightening presentations and great discussion. I'm sorry we didn't have time for more questions, but for everyone in attendance, I'll be sure to share their contact information if you want to reach out with additional questions. And as I mentioned in the beginning, NASEO is going to be continuing this work, hosting more focused webinars and developing a just energy transition framework for states. So thank you again to DOE for supporting this event, and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.